Species. Unite.
If people say, okay, I recycle, and then somebody sees you throwing out a little candy wrapper, nobody's going to point at you and say, ha, I saw you threw away a recyclable piece, right? But if I say I'm vegan, and then I eat a slice of halal, and halal is made with eggs, somebody will say, it has eggs. You're not really vegan. And so that's just kind of weird.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Novogratz. This is Species Unite. We have a favor to ask. If you like today's episode and you have a spare minute, could you please rate and review Species Unite on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts? It really helps people to find the show. This conversation is with Galina Hale. Galina is a professor of economics at UC Santa Cruz, and she's also the co-founder and chief research officer of FSI, Food System Innovations, where her husband, David, is CEO. David was on the podcast a couple of weeks ago. Galina is also a long-distance athlete. She's completed multiple marathons, triathlons, and the Ironman. How you doing?
Good. It's good to see you.
So many people that have come on here went vegan because they had an animal thing. Can we start talking about that and, just how and why you went vegetarian and vegan?
Absolutely. We're talking now about 15 years ago. I did not even think about my diet that much. I tried to eat healthy, was somewhat athletic. And my boss at the time was vegetarian. And I asked him, why are you vegetarian? And he said, well, I'm vegetarian for economic reasons, because it takes so many resources to produce, animal-based meal compared to 20 times compared to the plant-based meal. And I'm an economist, obviously. He's an economist. And it just made sense to me. And then I'm a very rational kind of, calculating person. And so I started thinking, just the fact that I even asked that question. So I started analyzing, why did I even ask that question? Why are you vegetarian? And that's because there's so many reasons to be vegetarian. There is an environmental reason. Now there is a climate reason. There is a resource economics reason, health reason, and most obvious animal welfare reason. And so just the fact that I asked that question made me think, well, there's so many reasons to be vegetarian. What are the reasons to not be vegetarian, right? So I'm an economist, costs and benefits. And so the reason not to be vegetarian is really, I like what it tastes like. And it just seemed like a bit selfish. And so I thought, okay, let me try to be vegetarian because there are so many reasons, and I talked to my doctor, is there reason to not be vegetarian? And she's like, no, I think, in fact, it's good for you to be vegetarian. And so, at the time I was reading some self-help book that was saying, if you want to make a lifestyle change, try it for 2 weeks, commit to 2 weeks, because after 2 weeks, you have the beginning of habit formation. And if you like it, it's easier to keep it as a habit after 2 weeks. And if you don't, you can always go back. So I made a commitment to 2 weeks. And after 1 week, I noticed that I was feeling better. Running after a bus, I wasn't getting out of breath as much as before. Just generally, my body felt lighter. And I really liked it, so I stuck with that. I did still eat fish and shellfish for about 6 months more. And then I went to Hong Kong. I was invited to visit the university and I gave a talk and they took me to a fancy dinner at the seafood place where you had to go to the aquarium and pick your victim that will then be cooked for you. And that just seemed completely wrong to me. I did not enjoy the meal. I did not like that. And that was the last time I ate fish. And then, walking in Hong Kong by the restaurant, you see the aquarium in the window and you see, oh, there's such beautiful fish. And then you realize, oh, that's a restaurant. That's food display. That started rubbing me the wrong way. And I think that's basically when kind of my cognitive dissonance started to go away in terms of thinking that I'm a good person and yet causing harm to other sentient beings because I wasn't doing it 3 times a day anymore. Made it easier for me to reconcile that and decide that I don't want to do it anymore. I still ate shellfish for a while until I have a lot of stories. It's all event-based for me. My sister-in-law gave me a gift, like it's a cute gift really for little girls where you get an oyster that has a pearl inside and you get to open it and get out the pearl. And so I had this visceral experience of opening that oyster. I could feel how it didn't want to be opened, And so I'm like, okay, well, that's an animal, like if you try to tear a leaf off the plant, it's not really pushing back like
Right.
that. And so that was the last time I ate shellfish. And then, once I learned about egg industry and dairy industry, and I learned about how harmful dairy is to our bodies, I basically went vegan and, it helped that at the time there were some good vegan cheeses around. So it was easy to break that addiction. And now I've been vegan for 10 years at least, I think. And I'm happy about that.
You said you were having a hard time running after the bus, but you're a triathlete. So when did that start?
I started doing triathlon around the time that I became vegetarian because I realized so running was hard for me. I was already biking to work and I was swimming regularly. Not well, but I was swimming. Running I never enjoyed, but once I stopped eating meat, I started to enjoy the running. And so then kind of the pieces all fell together. And then 6 years ago, I actually completed the full Ironman. And it was a lot of fun. I couldn't have possibly trained for it without a healthy vegan diet, that's for sure.
Talking to your husband about this with martial arts, I told him I run ultras and I started right around the time I went vegan. I ran marathons before that, but not really long distance. So many people that I know that run them are vegan. We all know that, yes, there's something about being vegan and being able to do endurance sports, like for longevity too. And so when someone comes on the show like you, who's doing this, and especially you weren't a runner, it's just more proof that diet means a lot when it comes to this kind of stuff.
Can I just mention that you said, oh, I did marathons before, but nothing long distance?
I actually had done a bunch of marathons and I never really liked them. The switch to ultras, because they're in nature, because it's not stressful, there's something about just the whole thing of it that I love them. And I never loved a marathon.
Because I do trail marathons now, specifically because there is no pressure to complete in any kind. If you have 6,000 feet elevation gain, nobody's expecting you to finish in 3 hours, right? So 5.5 hours is a good result. And I'm actually enjoying that a lot more, because there is variety, you go up and you go down, you use different muscles, you can walk.
I would love trail marathons. I've just never done one, but it's the nature thing and it's the no pressure thing and it's the not that many people. It just doesn't have that intensity of being in an urban marathon where somehow you feel really stressed the whole time. They're very anti-stress.
And there is a community feature to that too, I think. Yeah.
And it's a lot of vegans are do it. And so I know that there's a connection, but I don't know what the proof is. But we see more and more people doing triathlons and ultra marathons who are vegan. And there's definitely something that's making it doable.
Yeah, you talk to David. Yeah. So I think his hypothesis is that it's so much easier to digest plants than it is to digest animal protein. And so you can exercise a lot sooner after a meal if your meal was plant-based. So more generally, a lot of my friends who are runners, they would say, oh no, I can't run after lunch, until 7 p.m. I'm like, oh, that's odd. I can run at 2. So I think that's part of it. I think we're using so many of our energy resources to metabolize, especially dairy, that like no other species of animals consume milk when they're adults, much less milk of a different species. So I think it just takes so much energy of our bodies to even digest that stuff that, there is less energy left for fun.
Yeah. Okay, I want to talk about economics since you are my very first economist to ever come on the show. Let's just start with what you were talking about briefly at the beginning in terms of when you went vegetarian and you looked at it from that perspective.
In terms of resources, I mean, it's really not so much economics as like accounting,
yeah.
right? Let's just see like what goes into producing, say, a burger. So you got to feed the cow for, a year or two, depending. So I actually went to the website where they sell animal feed. The top animal feeds are soy, wheat, and corn. Okay, we can eat soy, wheat, and corn. So instead of feeding those commodities to a cow for 2 years, why not just us eating, soy and wheat are high in protein, corn is high in carbohydrates, hydrates. We can eat this stuff. It's cheaper, and we don't need an intermediary that also produces, all kind of byproducts that we don't want, and, potential for zoonotic disease and things like that. So for me, animal is a technology we use to transfer plants into something we can eat. And we have other technologies available to us. For example, in case of soy, we have really good technology of making tofu and tempeh and soy milk. And you can just, edamame, you can just boil soybeans and eat them. And so why do we have such a complex technology to get that nutrition that is so inefficient and so old? It's like a 10,000-year-old technology that we're using. And now we are able to make plant-based burgers. If you really, really like the taste of a burger, you can have an Impossible Burger that's made of soy. And, it's nutritionally better for you because it doesn't have any cholesterol. It doesn't have any diseases, antibiotics, and things like that.
With plant-based burgers especially, but the whole plant-based world at the moment, it's been getting knocked around by the media, right? And is that justified?
I want to be fair. So what we want to see is something that tastes as good, is as convenient, and is not more expensive. And so I would say for the products that, most meat eaters would tell you they taste as good, they tend to be more expensive than the animal products. And the products that seem to be more competitive on price, most people would say they don't taste as good or they taste different. There is another barrier that I think the industry is facing is that, if I go to the store and I buy chicken nuggets, I know what to expect they're going to taste, right? There's a whole variety of plant-based chicken nuggets, chicken alternative nuggets, that I wouldn't know what to expect, right? And if I have to be conscious of my budget, I'd be hesitant to pay extra for something I don't know what it's going to taste, whether my kids are going to eat it. I'm not going to pay $8 for something that then my kid's going to say, I don't like it. Right. So I'm just going to go for old and familiar. So I think we need more of, in-store sampling. We need maybe food industry, like KFC tried to incorporate plant-based chicken, I think, in their menu. Burger King had a Beyond Burger, I think.
They're Impossible, I think.
Impossible. Okay. So the problem with those experiments, I would say, is that they charge you a premium for the plant-based. Right. So then, you introduce something that is a budget food place, right? And budget food service. And people who go there, they go because it's cheap and fast and convenient. And then there is something they could try. And again, they don't know if they're going to like it. And it's more expensive. So you kind of stack the cards against yourself a little bit when doing that. So I think to do like a proper introduction and a proper testing of whether consumers like those products, we shouldn't put additional barriers like extra price, right? And so I think So that's a little bit on the consumer side for the industry. On the producer side, what is happening, some of the brands that are doing relatively well, they are hitting this kind of doldrums of growth, I would call it. What I mean is that in the beginning of the new company, it's relatively easy to get investment, because you're a startup, you don't need that much money and you grow really fast and it's all kind of sexy. And then you hit a level at which, okay, now you just need to build more warehouses and processing plants. And it's just capital investment that you need that does not result in very high returns. It has returns, but they're just not as high as hedge funds would like. It's completely unsexy. And so they have hard time getting funding for this kind of stage of growth where they just need to scale up. And given the way our retail and as well as food service industries are organized, if you don't have a steady volume, you're just not going to get a shelf space, right? And so they're just kind of a little bit of in a catch-22 situation where they need the money to scale up, but they can't get the money because they can't get the price parity.
What changes that?
So I think there's something unique about plant-based alternatives, and it's that it does not really satisfy a kind of unsatisfied need of the consumers. So initially things grew really fast because there were vegans who wanted to eat meat-like stuff.
Yeah.
So that's where it grew fast. But then now all the vegans who wanted to buy Beyond Sausage are already buying Beyond Sausage. So now we want to expand it to general population. General population does not really need to substitute anything, right? And so I think that's why those conversations are important, because you want people to say, oh, well, maybe I should try being vegan. Well, now it's very easy to be vegan because you can eat the same thing you've eaten before. Might cost you a little bit more, but it's only going to cost you more for the burger. On average, it's going to cost you less, because if you're going to make like a vegan chili, beans are super cheap.
Yeah.
And so I think what's needed is investment. But, if you think about other products, they would, the newly introduced products, they would be satisfying some need. And one example from the food industry would be, non-dairy milks, right? They are different because we have people who are lactose intolerant. We have, breastfeeding mothers who are recommended to not eat milk because the babies can get a colic from it. And so we have that market to grow into. For the plant-based alternatives, there isn't really a market to grow into. We're kind of trying to create that market. And we need to convince people to switch when they don't really feel a need to switch. And so that's where it's so important to get to the price parity. Because if I can tell you, look, you can have the same chicken nuggets for half the price, and the kids wouldn't even know the difference, it's a no-brainer. But we need to first scale up to get there. And so we need investment. And it has to be, as good, as convenient, and cheaper. If, maybe same price, but ideally cheaper than what people find with the animal products to be.
And is this something that you guys are working on at FSI?
Yeah, so there is one project, I'm not sure how much I'm allowed to talk about it publicly, where we are trying to see if there is a way to scale up some of the products, potentially through creating contracts with food service companies, the ones that provide lunches and dinners, at offices, hospitals, cafeterias, like large ones like Compass and Sodexo. So we are trying to see if there is a way that we can help those companies scale up by having buyers commit to purchasing their products, essentially. So that's one of the projects that we're involved in. Another is just trying to figure out if there is more fundamental research needed on the actual products, whether it's, precision fermentation, fungi-based, plant-based, or, cell-based alternatives, if we need more fundamental research. So we are doing some of the taste tests that are run by a professional marketing company that we're trying to get meat eaters, a representative slice of population, to rate products they taste in a blind taste, and there is a meat product among the things they taste, so we can benchmark everything against that. So the question then is, do we have the products that consumers find to be as good? And if so, then we can pick those products and try to help them scale up.
Have you already been doing this, the taste tests?
We did one a few years ago on burger and chicken, and the results of that you can see on our website. I did a little write-up that basically there was one burger that came kind of close to the actual meat, and it was not a fancy burger. It was like a Costco burger, right? And with chicken, there was nothing that came close to the actual chicken.
Wow.
And so we need to work more on that. And chicken is very difficult because it's really cheap to produce. One thing I didn't mention, one reason it's so hard for alternative proteins to compete is because we have huge subsidies for the animal. You'd say, going back to what I was saying, if it takes so many resources to produce animal product, it should be cheaper to produce plant-based alternative. And eventually it will be once we're at scale. But there are subsidies, their animal feed subsidies, their water subsidies, there are some many cases actually when some concentrated animal farming operation, CAFO, would create some kind of environmental disaster. They would then get a grant from Environmental Protection Agency to clean it up, which is like, yeah, good, they get to clean it up, but that just means next time they mess things up, they will get paid for cleaning it up. So that's kind of a backward thing. They should be bearing the cost. And so we have a lot of animal ag subsidies, and that makes it really difficult to compete. So one thing we're trying to do is talk to policymakers about it's hard to remove the subsidies. We all understand that, but maybe providing some subsidies for alternative proteins. And there, frequently the conversation I'm having, it has to do with climate change, right? Animal agriculture contributes, depending how you count, between 20 and 30% of total greenhouse gas emissions. So we don't talk about that much. No. And so we've been subsidizing alternative energy and alternative transportation. The government helped Tesla a lot to come up with a new car. But we don't talk about alternative proteins. And it's very analogous, right? Like you have solar and wind that has been heavily subsidized in R&D as well as scaling up to substitute for fossil fuels. It's very analogous to substitute plant-based alternatives for animal food because that reduces greenhouse gas emissions. And in fact, it has a much bigger impact on the stock of greenhouse gases because methane that comes mostly from cows, and people forget, there's like, oh, I don't eat beef because of methane. Well, dairy comes from cows too. But, so methane does not stay in the atmosphere as long as the CO2. And it's 40 times more potent. And so basically what creates global warming is a concentration of greenhouse gases. It's not the flow. It's like a stock of what's already there. And the stuff that's already there slowly dissipates. And CO2 takes hundreds of years to dissipate. Methane can dissipate in a couple of decades. And so if you want to affect global warming trajectory, reducing methane is much more impactful. I'm not saying that we shouldn't reduce CO2. We should by now we should do absolutely everything we can, but that would be a much faster impact on actual warming of the atmosphere.
Why is government not subsidizing plant-based alternatives?
Well, there's a little bit in the Inflation Reduction Act mention of alternatives that some of that could be used. Some of those grants could be used for alternatives. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly why. I think there is a pushback from animal agriculture for sure. And, animal agriculture does not like anything that, like they would be resistant to removing their subsidies, obviously. And this is kind of supporting their competition. So I don't know the details of that, but I imagine animal ag lobby is pretty strong. There is also concern about family farmers, ranchers. It's a very small percent of population. We actually at FSI we did the calculation because people would ask, like, well, how many people do we actually are we talking about? And I'm not saying that that's not important just because there aren't too many of them. When you think about animal agriculture, a very small part of that is coming from family farmers, right? So people have, no matter what the pictures you see on the packaging, this is not how animal products are produced.
What is it, like a couple percent?
Yeah, a couple of percent. Yeah, it's in single digits. So mostly what we're talking about, if we want to reduce the size of animal ag, we're talking about people losing jobs in CAFOs and feedlots. The feedlot is a nice word for place where we slaughter cows and other animals, and chicken farms. And I'm actually working on a study to see how those production facilities affect crime rates and mental health of people who live in towns and are employed by those places. In terms of physical health, we already have the data from Government Accountability Office that chicken industry is one of the highest, injury and sickness on the job rates in the U.S. And it has to do with the way we keep the broiler chickens in completely unsanitary conditions. And so that affects the workers who work there. And so all I guess I'm trying to say is those jobs are not necessarily great jobs. And if we transition to alternatives, there's a lot of labor required in growing, produce, for example, right? So we're going to still have to grow soy and corn and wheat for plant-based alternatives, but not as much. So we're going to have land freed up so we can grow more tomatoes and lettuces and cucumbers. Those are labor-intensive crops. And I don't know if anybody ever surveyed. I would love to see a survey of people working in CAFOs and feedlots, asking them, would they rather, if they could get the same pay, would they rather be out in the field, or do they prefer to keep their job? I don't want to answer, for those people, but I think, the concern about losing jobs is valid, but it's not unsolvable problem. And so then there is a family farmers and ranchers, but if you look at their financials, they do not make much money at all, right? So the way our food industry is structured is that they really don't have market power. They sell their products very cheaply. It's hard for them to find the distributors because everything else is so concentrated. They really just have to live with what they're being offered.
In the same way that the chicken industry, there really aren't small chicken farmers anymore, right? They are kind of all owned now. So they're almost like indentured servants to the big ag chicken people. There's a push for that toward pigs and cows.
Yeah. So what happens, the pig industry is very concentrated in the US. I just happened, because of all the Prop 12 discussion and the EATS Act, I know a lot about pig industry in the US. It's very concentrated, but they subcontract, a lot of them, about 40% of actually raising the hogs is subcontracted to a smaller size contractors. But because those contractors don't have the market power, they only have one buyer, or Smithfield is Chinese-owned company, has 3 times as much volume as the second biggest US company. So basically, for a lot of people, that's the only buyer. And so whatever price they offer, you're going to have to sell for. And so they don't make a lot of money. And even if they want to transition to doing something else, say growing oats for oat milk, right? Most of the US, you can grow oats. They can't really transition because it takes a couple of years of capital investment and lack of revenue to change what you're doing. And you need to train and you need to hire farm help. And that's very hard to do. It's very hard to find farm workers these days. And they don't have any savings, right? Because they weren't able to make enough money to have any savings. And so, there is a huge issue with US family farmers
Yeah, it's bleak. I mean, it's one of those things. I think when you're in it, you
Mm-hmm.
can feel really optimistic. Cultivated meats on the market now. Alternatives are
Mm-hmm.
everywhere. You can pretty much go to any restaurant on the planet, and there's something for you. But the bigger picture, the hurdles to getting there and to getting animals out of the food system seem almost like insurmountable. They're massive.
Yeah. No, and I think, in the US, maybe, the trends are kind of a little bit subtle in the US, like the total number of chickens, say, consumed in the US is going down, but total pounds of chicken consumed is going up, which means every chicken is now grown to a bigger size with growth hormones, presumably, and antibiotics and whatnot. And so we're still eating more meat every year. And that's the US. The numbers in China and India and Brazil are growing much, much faster. What happens is that, even if the population is not growing, like in China last couple of years, partly because of the
Yeah.
lockdowns, not so many babies were born. But as people become wealthier, because animal food is considered a luxury, people are introducing more and more animal products in their diet as they become more wealthy. And that's not necessarily good for their health, but that's just the
Yeah.
culture that, partly Western culture that's being accepted all over the world. And even in India, where traditionally, there's very, very little animal food, especially in the South, that number is growing very rapidly. And so the young people, they want to live Western life. That is viewed, you watch TV, that's what
Yeah.
is being considered normal and attractive. And, we kind of need a paradigm shift. We need to start thinking about eating animals as something that you really don't want to do. And humans did very little of it for thousands of years. It's only like last 150 years that we've been consuming massive amounts of animal food. Normally it would be just a special occasion, the day you slaughter your pig once a year, that's when you eat meat.
What you said earlier too about climate, it not only very few people even talk about animal agriculture when it comes to climate. It's so not in the conversation, even though it's such a massive
Mhm.
part of the problem. So getting people to shift toward plant-based because of climate also seems pretty tough in terms of most people aren't even making the connection.
Yes, we need to talk about it. We really need to talk about it. And I think, we need to understand, like I care about climate a lot. I still use energy, right? So I didn't stop using energy. Well, I have solar, but whatever. I still occasionally have to use energy from the grid. So you don't have to go 100% vegan to help the world, right? Just eating less. And, that's one thing that when I talk to advocates, I say, look, we've been trying to get people to switch to vegan for like last 50 years, maybe 60 by now. And we've reached some, there's some success. But the numbers are still in single digits in percent of population that's vegan. So it's very hard to get, say, 10% of population to go vegan. But it's not as hard to get 100% of population to eat 10% less meat. The impact on the number of animals consumed is the same. But that's kind of the whole reducitarian movement. I'm very much in favor.
Yeah.
I think eventually we should live in the world where we don't consume animals for food because we really don't have to, and it's kind of bad for us anyway. But to get there, there's so many different paths, and one of the paths is, reduce slowly. You know, get used to it. And I think the most medical profession would agree that reducitarian. The Eats Lancet diet. So there was a big study done on what is the ultimate healthy diet. It has vastly more plant-based, foods included in that healthy diet than what currently is recommended by FDA.
So my dad was 7 or 8 years ago, no, maybe 9 years ago. My dad was in heart failure. He was like literally on the way out. And he went to Dean Ornish, who said, "You have to go vegan or you're going to die." And he didn't want to die, so he went vegan. He's not 100% vegan. If he'll eat a piece of cake, and it has eggs in it, but he's 95% vegan. And he's 86 and he rides his exercise bike every day. He's really healthy. He's great. It literally saved his life. And this happens to a lot of people. You hear stories. You hear Eric Adams, the mayor of New York. You hear these stories, but yet still that argument, hey, maybe you should go vegan for your health, that also doesn't really seep in to mainstream culture. Like doctors aren't pushing it. And it saves lives. You don't have to go 100% vegan. Reducing is super healthy. I agree with you. We need to get rid of the narrative that like to be vegan, you have to be like a Nazi about it, because it turns people away and it turns people off and it scares people and people don't want to be associated with it. Like a lot of people, they're just like, I don't hear you. I don't hear you. And most of us that are vegan were once not, and we didn't hear it. I don't know how you shift that narrative. That needs to become more of the general kind of way we shift toward what we're doing.
So we're working on some of these projects, like, there's some blended products in the market where, they mix burger with mushrooms. So there's lower contact. In the same burger, there's less content of meat, and there's some other stuff in there that's much healthier for you. So David and I are kicking around the idea of like flex number, right? Like, flex number bet. Maybe you're flexitarian. That's another term that's being used, right? So you're mostly eating plants, but sometimes, social situation, we're not. And, each product can have like a rating, right? So if it's 100% plant-based, it would be 100. If it has 5% of animal stuff in it, it will be 95. If it's a steak, it's going to be 0. Right. So something like that people start thinking about continuum as opposed to all or nothing. And you're absolutely right. Like, if people say, okay, I recycle, and then somebody sees you throwing out a little candy wrapper, nobody's going to point at you and say, haha, I saw you threw away a recyclable piece. Right. But if I say I'm vegan and then I eat a slice of halal, and halal is made with eggs, somebody will say, oh, it has eggs. You're not really vegan. And so that's just kind of weird.
Because we don't really do that with much else.
Don't know why. Or like, I say, oh, okay, I'm vegan, but then I have some shoes I bought 20 years ago. I never, I still wear clothes from 20 years ago because I don't like buying new stuff. And they would be leather shoes and say, you're wearing leather shoes. You're not vegan. And I'm like, well, I bought them before I was vegan. You want me to throw them out?
Right.
And so now I say I eat vegan. So at least people don't like start looking at what I'm wearing. But it's just, there's too much judgment. And I think it kind of goes back to the old days when most vegans were ethical vegans. And I count myself in that category now. I actually think it is unethical to kill animals for our pleasure. But I think in the early days, all vegans were like that. And when you're like that, you do judge.
Yeah. Especially when you're new to it. When it's new and you just kind of had your eyes opened and now you want everybody else to see what you're seeing. And so you try to turn into a jerk for a while.
But I think, we should not judge. And there is this cognitive dissonance thing. And I think for vegans, even ethical vegans, to have a conversation that does not put your interlocutor on a defensive.
Yeah.
Because you don't start a conversation by saying you're an awful person. You just ate an egg, right? Do you even know how the eggs, what they do to male chicks? And so most people don't know what they do to male chicks. So just people research
that. And
that.
even if you told them, that it would go right out of their ears in about 2 seconds, unless they were really wanting to know.
Exactly. And there were actually some studies that, show that even if you have a very powerful and convincing message, there is a very high percentage of people who revert to their habits. So there was a study done where, you get to see a documentary of what happens in slaughterhouses and whatnot. And, and usually that affects people's desire to eat meat for about a week. And then, they go with friends to a brewery and they're going to have a burger.
Wow.
So it doesn't have, I'm sure there's some share of population that is affected and permanently, but I think we need more of to affect more people, it needs to be all of the above, right? You need to tell people why they should eat less animals, but you also need to provide people with means to eat less animals, the how part, which is where the alternatives come in, because it's hard for people to change lifestyle and it's culture. And they also need to be armed with a good kind of conversation so they don't feel like they have to defend themselves all the time for their choices.
That's one thing Beyond and Impossible did, is it made a lot of people that I know who would never eat vegan, eat vegan. Right? Like, even if it's just that one meal a week, or it's instead of a burger, like somehow that became acceptable as a vegan choice for super non-vegans. And that is the beginning of the change of the narrative.
I think also for people who choose to eat plant-based, I noticed like I have a lot of friends who are kind of like shy about it. They don't want to inconvenience. They're like pushed too much in the opposite direction from being judgmental. I think we shouldn't be that either. Like frequently, if I go to a burger place that serves an Impossible or Beyond, but otherwise is like a regular burger place, if I go with my meat eating friends, they would order a vegan burger or a vegetarian, maybe with real cheese or whatnot, just out of respect for me. They say, oh, I didn't want to eat meat in front of you. But then they like it. And they might do it again, and every time I have an event, I always say, well, I eat vegan. And frequently people at my table like, oh, how did you get this amazing food? And they have like a dried up piece of chicken on their plate.
Yeah. It's one of those things where it's hard to be optimistic, but you don't want to be pessimistic. Like, what are you?
Oh, I'm very optimistic. I am working on a paper that looks into how fast we need to substitute animal products for alternatives to achieve our climate goals. And the answer is we need to switch to alternatives really fast. So when you look at these numbers, it's kind of scary, like we need to do stuff yesterday. On the other hand, there is more recognition now of this being an issue, and more people are talking about. And every time I talk about it, fewer and fewer people are surprised. And I think for me, the climate angle, I think probably is the one that's going to make people move. Not all people. But, I was talking to somebody from New Zealand and they said half of New Zealand greenhouse gas emissions comes from animal ag. Half, right? Because they just grow so many ruminants and
wow,
and they export, and that's one of their main exports. And they, just like Norway needs to think about what they're going to do when nobody's going to want their oil anymore. New Zealand needs to think about what they're going to do when nobody's going to want meat anymore. And they are thinking about that. And that's because to me, it's quite a realistic scenario that we will manage as a society to switch to more sustainable way of living. And I think another angle on this is also we see more and more zoonotic diseases, which is a bad thing, obviously, for many reasons. But it does allow plant-based alternatives to, step into the void. There was a major pig disease in China a couple of years ago. There was a pork shortage. Pork was very expensive. That's when plant-based alternatives can step in and say, hey, this is disease-free and could be cheaper, at least at that period of time. So, and I think governments are finally taking interest. Chinese government is very interested in alternatives because they're just facing a resource constraint. Going back to what we started with. They have a large population, limited land. They're importing now a lot of animal products from Brazil, which is cutting Amazon in order to grow more soy to feed the cows. And so it's not a sustainable way of feeding the population. Plus, you never, as a large country, you don't want to rely on a foreign country for your food supply. It's geopolitically kind of scary. And so they are thinking about alternatives and they are pushing for that. And so we're going to see more and more of that. And I think that's also where US politicians might say, even if for no other reason, to have a competitive advantage with respect to China is something that US is always interested in. We don't want to rely on China for our food supply. If they are the ones who are going to come up with a better technology that's cheaper, then most consumers will switch to cheaper goods, and we import those from China, and now that becomes a geopolitical threat.
That's a really good angle, though, because if it gets politicians on the side of alternatives, because the animal welfare is not going to, but climate and China both can.
And again, there are so many reasons that animal agriculture is kind of a thing of the past.
We've had to do this yesterday, but how do we speed it up now, right?
Yeah, so I think all of the above. I think what you're doing is very important. Information, advocacy, extremely important, because we need to create demand for the alternatives. And, ideally, we want to live in a world where we eat whole foods, plant-based diet, so we don't actually need the alternative, because it's much healthier to just, cook your rice and beans and put some vegetables. That's like a traditional diet of civilizations, and people lived for 1,000 years and didn't have a lot of the diseases we have now. But to get there, and we need to also, change the political environment and change the cultural environment. When I say we need a paradigm shift, people say, oh, well, that's never going to happen. But it has happened. We had agricultural revolution, was a complete switch from hunting, gathering to growing food. Or maybe it's this 1 in 10,000 years time that we're living through, which is kind of exciting. Yeah. We could be, like everybody still talks about agricultural revolution 10,000 years from then. And so maybe we're living in a time of, plant-based revolution or whatever, food system revolution that, people will talk about 10,000 years from now if we survive as a species.
I hope so. I hope we are. And it's a really good way to look at it, that we're in the middle of a plant-based revolution, plant food system revolution. I love it.
Yeah, we need some name for that.
Galina, thank you so much for this. It's been awesome.
And so nice talking to you. And I really appreciate the work you're doing.
To learn more about Galina and to learn more about food system innovations, go to our website, speciesunite.com. We will have links to everything. We are on Facebook and Instagram at Species Unite. If you have a spare moment and you could do us a favor, please subscribe, rate, review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. It really helps people find the show. If you'd like to support the podcast, we would greatly appreciate it. Go to our website, speciesunite.com, and click donate. I would like to thank everyone at Species Unite, including Gary Knudsen, Caitlin Pierce, Amy Jones, Paul Healy, Santina Polke, Ayana Peoples, Olivia Deming, and Anna Kolner, who wrote and performed today's music. Thank you for listening. Have a wonderful day.